when Graham Vale lifts his crystal glass and says, "Tonight Tessa finally marries into a family with standards." I do not flinch. I only smile. The man insulting me has no idea that every guest in this ballroom is minutes away from learning how he built his fortune. 18 years ago, one buried fire report turned a 19-year-old sister into a mother overnight. Before this reception ends, his dynasty and a lie polished for 2 decades will publicly burn. I am Penelope Harrison, and I am currently sitting in the back row of a glass cage. The Vale family calls it a conservatory, an architectural marvel of steel and glass erected specifically for this evening on their private waterfront estate just outside Newport. The ocean crashes against the cliffs outside, entirely muted by the thick acoustic panels disguised as climbing white roses. Inside, the temperature is controlled to exactly 68 degrees, ensuring that not a single bead of sweat ruins the silk and satin draped over the wealthiest shoulders in New England. Everything in this room is polished, profoundly expensive, and emotionally desolate. It is a beautiful place to freeze to death. I chose a seat near the back by choice, placed at a table populated by second-tier business associates who do not quite know what to make of my plain navy dress. It is impeccably tailored, bought with 2 weeks of my salary from Stonebridge Risk and Compliance, but in a room where diamond tennis bracelets cost more than a 4-year college degree. I am clearly the charity case. I prefer the distance. It gives me a clear, unobstructed vantage point of the head table, where my entire world is currently anchored. My younger sister, Tessa Harrison, sits trapped beneath 40 pounds of hand-embroidered tulle and antique lace, trying desperately to look happy. She is marrying Owen Vale, the golden heir to a real estate dynasty I have never trusted and cannot bring myself to embrace. Owen leans toward her, whispering something that makes her lips curve, but the smile does not reach her eyes. Her knuckles are stark white where they grip the stem of her champagne flute. She looks like a hostage who has finally convinced herself that the ransom was worth the price of her freedom. And then there is Graham Vale. When Graham stands up to deliver the father of the groom toast, the ambient noise of clinking silver and soft jazz vanishes in less than 4 seconds. He does not ask for the room's attention. He simply assumes ownership of it. He radiates the lethal, easy charm of a man who has spent the last 30 years dictating every contract, commanding every boardroom, and purchasing every outcome he desires. His tuxedo is sharp enough to draw blood, and his posture is that of a king surveying a conquered province. "Family," Graham begins, his voice rolling through the hidden surround speakers like expensive, well-modulated thunder. "We gather tonight to celebrate a profound addition to our legacy." He paces slowly behind the massive head table, holding a crystal glass of vintage champagne that I know costs $800 a bottle. When Owen first brought Tessa home, I admit, I wondered if she could handle the weight of this world. The Vale name is not merely a title, it is an institution. It requires grace. It requires a certain caliber of relentless endurance. He pauses perfectly, letting his gaze sweep over the sea of upturned, expectant faces before finally landing on me in the shadows. "Tessa, my dear, you have blossomed. You have shown us that true elegance can be learned, even when it is not inherited." A soft murmur ripples through the seated guests. It is the sound of old money recognizing a veiled insult and waiting with bated breath to see if it will be followed by a killing stroke. Graham's smile widens, showing perfectly capped, blindingly white teeth. We all know the severe hardships Tessa faced, raised by her older sister, Penelope, after tragic circumstances left them entirely adrift. A noble effort, surely. He raises his glass slightly in my direction, but his eyes are flat, unreadable, and reptilian. But tonight, we celebrate a true elevation. Tonight, Tessa finally leaves behind that desperate survival mode. She no longer has to rely on the cheap instability of a fractured home. She is a Vale now. She is finally safe. The silence that follows is thick, absolute, and suffocating. The crowd laughs, a brittle, uneasy sound that echoes off the glass walls. Several guests shift uncomfortably in their plush velvet chairs, unsure whether to treat the public castration of the bride's sister as a high society joke or a shocking breach of decorum. At the head table, Tessa's forced smile completely shatters. Her face goes ashen, her breath catching visibly in her throat. Beside her, Owen looks utterly blindsided, his jaw dropping slightly as he stares at his father in horrified disbelief. He clearly had absolutely no idea this humiliation was coming. I do not flush. I do not look away. I do not drop my head in shame. Instead, I let the insult hang in the chilled air, absorbing the collective, pitying stares of 300 people. I study the room. I watch the way the catering waiters freeze by the kitchen doors, afraid to make a sound. I note the glowing screens of a dozen smartphones recording the speech from the middle tables, capturing my supposed defeat in high definition. I observe the arrogant tilt of Graham's chin, the absolute certainty radiating from his pores that he has just crushed a lower-class nuisance beneath his polished heel. He wants me to run out of the room crying. He wants Tessa to feel entirely dependent on his financial mercy from this day forward. I take a slow sip of my water. It is ice cold and tastes faintly of cucumber. As I lower my glass, my gaze drifts past Graham to the grand foyer just outside the open conservatory arches. The event planners have set up a pretentious, museum-style display of the Vale family history, a massive, illuminated board chronicling decades of their real estate conquests. Spotlights highlight framed blueprints, golden shovels from ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and corporate milestones printed on heavy cardstock. One particular photograph, blown up and mounted near the bottom left corner, catches my eye. It is an old, grainy redevelopment site from Baltimore, a brick row house project surrounded by chain-link fencing. It is clearly meant to represent Graham's early philanthropic housing efforts, a public testament to his civic virtue roughly 18 years ago. To anyone else in this opulent room, it is just a picture of dirty bricks and rusty scaffolding. To me, it is the exact street corner where my mother burned to death. The air leaves my lungs entirely, not in a panic, but in a wave of absolute, terrifying clarity. The vague suspicions I have harbored for the last 6 months, the fragmented pieces of contractor paperwork I have hoarded in a cardboard box under my bed, suddenly snap together with the violent, undeniable force of a steel trap. Graham Vale did not just build his massive empire near my family's ruin, he built his fortune directly on top of our ashes. A door opens inside my mind, cold, heavy, and full of terrible light. Graham is still looking at me, holding his crystal glass high, expecting a reaction, expecting a complete emotional surrender. The uneasy laughter has died down, leaving an expectant, suffocating hush over the ballroom. I slowly push my chair back. The wooden legs scrape against the marble floor, a harsh, ugly sound that cuts sharply through the curated tension. I stand up. I do not rush. I smooth the skirt of my simple navy dress with both hands, ensuring every single movement is deliberate and painfully calm. The entire room holds its collective breath, waiting for a screaming match or a sobbing retreat. I meet Graham's triumphant eyes across the wide expanse of white linen, sterling silver, and floating candles. It is a truly beautiful venue, Mr. Vale, I say, my voice carrying cleanly and evenly across the quiet room without the need for a microphone. I keep my tone entirely conversational, devoid of any raw anger or visible hurt. But in my line of work, I have learned that paint always looks strongest right before the wall starts peeling. I hold his gaze for exactly 5 seconds, just long enough for the arrogant amusement to falter on his face, replaced by a microscopic, panicked flicker of confusion. Then, I sit back down, cross my legs, and fold my hands quietly in my lap. The guests exchange bewildered, alarmed glances. Graham clears his throat, the triumphant rhythm of his grand speech entirely broken, and awkwardly attempts to pivot back to his son. But the psychological damage to his flawless, expensive moment is already done. He thinks he has just put a poor girl in her rightful place. He does not yet understand that this public humiliation is not the beginning of my defeat. It is the precise moment I decided to tear his entire dynasty down to the foundational studs. 18 years earlier, the air in our Baltimore apartment did not smell like ocean water and expensive orchids. It smelled like copper, cheap linoleum, and burning dust. We lived on the third floor of a row street row house that was undergoing a massive, city-subsidized rehabilitation. It was the kind of project politicians love to talk about during election cycles, promising safe housing for vulnerable families while simultaneously turning a blind eye to the contractors cutting every possible corner to maximize their profit margins. My mother, Dana Harrison, spent the last 3 months of her life arguing with men who wore suits and hard hats, men who never looked her in the eye. "The walls are hot," she would tell the property manager over the phone, pacing our narrow kitchen until the floorboards creaked. "The new wiring is wrong. It hums at night. You can feel the heat radiating through the plaster." They told her she was imagining things. They told her she did not understand basic construction. They told her to be grateful for the cheap rent and the fresh coat of paint. Then came the night in late November. I was 19 years old, working a closing shift at a diner across town, wiping down sticky tables and counting crumpled single-dollar bills from the tip jar. My father had already been gone for 4 years by then, erased from our lives by a suffocating avalanche of debt and the relentless, ugly pull of addiction. He walked out on a Tuesday afternoon and never came back, leaving my mother to hold the sky up entirely by herself. When she died in that fire, the sky fell directly onto my shoulders. The official fire investigator stood in the soot-stained remains of our living room a few days later, clicked his pen, and declared it tenant negligence. He looked at me, a hollowed-out 19-year-old girl clutching her little sister's hand, and said my mother must have left a faulty space heater plugged in too close to the living room curtains. He wrote it down on a clipboard. Because he wore a badge and used authoritative language. His theory instantly became the undisputed truth, but I knew the truth. I remembered the unnatural buzzing in the plaster walls. I had the voicemail she left me at 6 o'clock that evening, her voice tight with frustration and exhaustion, saying, "Pen, I am calling the city inspector tomorrow morning. I saw the subcontractor's truck today. They are doing something with the breaker boxes, and they are cutting corners again. Overnight, I ceased being a sister and became a mother. I had no instruction manual, 0 savings, and absolutely no safety net to catch us. I traded my college brochures and teenage milestones for a relentless rotation of grueling jobs. I worked 40 hours a week waiting tables at a diner on Route 40, picking up another 20 hours doing temporary bookkeeping for a failing auto repair shop, and somehow squeezed in night classes at the community college. My youth evaporated in the space of a single week, replaced by a cold, heavy panic that sat at the base of my throat every hour of every day. Tessa grew up believing I was invincible. She was so young, and I fought like a feral animal to keep her innocence intact. She never saw me cry on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. because we were $40 short on the electric bill and the shutoff notice was sitting on the counter. She never knew that our bright, cheerful grocery shopping trips were actually exercises in mathematical warfare, calculating the price of generic peanut butter and discount bread down to the final penny. When I bought her a second-hand winter coat from a thrift store and told her it was a rare vintage find, she wore it like she was royalty. I absorbed the sheer terror of our poverty so she could have a childhood. I built a fortress around her mind, brick by grueling brick, ensuring she was fed, enrolled in a good school, and emotionally whole. 2 weeks after we buried our mother in a cheap pine casket, I took a city bus down to the Baltimore Municipal Archives. I did not know what I was doing. I was just an angry teenager running on profound grief and bad coffee. But I knew how to read numbers, and I had spent enough time balancing the auto shop's ledgers to know how to spot a lie hidden in a spreadsheet. I sat at a scratched wooden table for 8 hours, pulling the public permit history for the Row Street Rehabilitation Project. Even with my untrained eyes, the inconsistencies were glaring. Pages were conspicuously missing. Signatures from city officials overlapped with dates when the physical work had not even started. The entire case had been cleaned up, simplified, and quietly buried under a mountain of bureaucratic jargon. It was a masterclass in making a corporate crime look like a tragic accident. I started a collection that day, a heavy cardboard box that I shoved under my bed, dragging it with us to every cramped, drafty apartment we rented over the next decade. It held things no one else in the world valued. 3 half-burned photographs salvaged from the waterlogged wreckage, a photocopy of my mother's written complaint to the housing authority, stamped with a received date but completely ignored, a crumpled contractor invoice I found in the debris, listing a shell company that legally dissolved 3 days after the fire, a cassette tape holding that final, desperate voicemail, and one unsigned inspection page that made absolutely no logical sense in approval for complex electrical work that was clearly never reviewed by a human being. That box became the silent, beating heart of my adult life. It was not just a container of painful memories. It was a daily instruction manual. It taught me that monsters do not hide under the bed or in dark alleys. They hide in the paperwork. They hide behind limited liability corporations, intricate tax structures, and respectable language like urban revitalization and cost efficiency measures. That realization shaped every choice I made. It pushed me through a grueling accounting degree, surviving on 4 hours of sleep a night, and propelled me into the sharp, unforgiving world of forensic auditing. Now, I work at Stonebridge Risk and Compliance. We are a specialized forensic consulting firm. My entire career is dedicated to exposing the exact kind of polished fraud that killed my mother. I rip apart falsified financial statements, trace shadow accounts across international borders, and find the structural rot hidden behind fresh coats of corporate paint. I take down men who think their money makes them immune to consequences. The fire on Rowe Street burned away my family, but it forged something much harder in its place. I learned how to read the silence between the numbers, and I learned how to wait. When Tessa came to my apartment 8 months ago, her left hand was trembling so hard she could barely hold her coffee cup. She wore a diamond the size of a crushed almond, set in brilliant platinum. She had only been dating Graham Vale for 6 months. I had always imagined my little sister bringing home a teacher, perhaps a graphic designer, someone who understood the value of a hard-earned dollar and the comfortable weight of a quiet, ordinary life. Instead, she brought home the heir to a real estate empire. I desperately wanted to be thrilled for her. I wanted to pour the cheap Prosecco I had chilling in the refrigerator and toast to her endless happiness. But the name Vale sat heavy and cold in my stomach. Owen himself was a jarring contradiction to my ingrained prejudices. He was soft-spoken, prone to asking genuine questions, and completely devoid of the sharp-elbowed entitlement I typically associated with generational wealth. He held Tessa's coat. He listened intently when she spoke, tracking her words as if they were the most important sounds in the room. He was, terrifyingly, a truly decent man. But the breakneck speed of the proposal and the sheer, inescapable gravitational pull of his family's dynasty made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up long before I ever stepped foot inside their home. The first formal dinner took place at the Vale family townhouse in Boston, a massive, imposing brownstone that smelled of beeswax, old portraits, and silent money. The moment I walked through the heavy oak double doors, I felt an immediate, distinct drop in temperature that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter weather outside. Graham Vale was waiting in the drawing room. He did not step forward to greet me. He simply stood by the fireplace and assessed me. Within 5 minutes of pouring the first round of drinks, he had perfectly clocked me. He saw the poor relation, the gritty survivor who had scrubbed floors and balanced ledgers so his future daughter-in-law could attend a respectable university. "It is quite remarkable," Graham said over the first course of seared scallops, his tone dripping with a polished, weaponized condescension. "Tessa possesses such natural, effortless refinement. One would never guess her early years were so desperately challenging. You must be incredibly proud, Penelope, to have scraped together such a passable imitation of stability for her." I did not grip my silver fork tighter. I did not let my jaw clench. I simply smiled, a thin, polite curve of the lips, and thanked him. I recognized the tactic instantly. It was a calculated test. He wanted to see if I would bite, if I would reveal the rough, unpolished edges he assumed I possessed. He wanted me to act like the charity case he believed me to be. I gave him nothing but a mirror of his own terrifying politeness. As the six-course dinner progressed, the conversation naturally drifted toward the Vale corporate empire. Graham dominated the long dining table, speaking expansively of his legacy and his vision for the city. He used phrases that made the blood run absolutely freezing in my veins: public philanthropy, luxury redevelopment, urban revitalization. He spoke of taking blighted, forgotten neighborhoods and elevating them, cleansing them for a better class of citizen. Every polished, corporate word he used to describe his business model was a direct, horrifying echo of the sterile, bureaucratic language I had studied for nearly 2 decades in the city archives. It was the language of forced displacement, the language of a man who viewed human beings as inconvenient, easily erasable obstacles to a higher profit margin. After dessert was cleared, while Tessa and Owen were discussing floral arrangements in the parlor with Owen's mother, I quietly excused myself to find the restroom. Instead, I let my feet carry me down a dimly lit, silent hallway lined with dark walnut paneling. A heavy door stood slightly ajar at the end of the corridor, revealing Graham's private study. I slipped inside, pushing the door nearly shut behind me. The room smelled of expensive leather and aged scotch. The walls were a towering shrine to his own ego, covered from the baseboards to the ceiling in framed accolades, newspaper clippings, and ceremonial photographs. I moved silently across the thick Persian rug, reading the brass plaques, and then I stopped breathing. It was a framed, groundbreaking photograph hanging near the bottom corner of the room, tucked away from the more prominent, recent awards. The brass plate beneath it read, "Redmere Urban Housing, 1998, Redmere." The name struck me like a physical blow to the chest. It was one of the dissolved shell companies I had found listed on a crumpled, water-damaged contractor invoice hidden inside my cardboard box under my bed. I leaned closer to the glass, my eyes desperately scanning the faces in the photograph. Graham stood in the center, 20 years younger, smiling broadly and holding a golden shovel. But it was the man standing 2 paces behind him that made my heart slam violently against my ribs. A thick-necked construction supervisor wearing a white hard hat and a faded polo shirt. I knew that face. I had stared at it in a salvaged, charred newspaper clipping from the fire investigation. It was the man who had signed off on the electrical permits. The connection was no longer a vague, paranoid suspicion. It was staring me right in the face, framed in mahogany. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. I gripped the edge of the heavy desk to steady my trembling hands. My mother's death and this pristine, untouchable family were connected by a straight, undeniable line, but a photograph and a defunct company name were not enough. In my line of work at Stonebridge, assumptions get you fired. Concrete proof gets you indictments. I had found a thread, but it was far too thin to weaponize. If I accused Graham Vale based on a 20-year-old picture, he would crush me with a single phone call to his legal team, and Tessa would never speak to me again. He is a lot to handle, I know. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Owen was standing in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored trousers. He looked deeply embarrassed, staring at his father's wall of vanity with a sigh. "You handled him perfectly at dinner, by the way," Owen continued, stepping softly into the room. "Most people let him rattle them. I am so sorry he was so difficult tonight. He thinks intimidation is a form of affection, or at least a necessary screening process." I looked at Owen, really looked at him in the dim light of the study. There was absolutely no guile in his eyes, no hidden, malicious agenda. He was completely unaware of the blood staining his family's money. He was apologizing for bad manners, completely oblivious to the fact that his father was a predator. This was the first major agonizing complication of the night. The son was entirely innocent, even if the father was guilty. We walked back to the parlor together, Owen chatting lightly about the jazz band they had hired for the reception. I nodded and smiled at the appropriate intervals, but my mind was screaming. I looked at my sister, radiant and laughing on the velvet sofa, holding the hand of a man she genuinely loved. I realized then that if my instincts were right, Tessa was not merely marrying into extreme wealth. She was about to marry into the exact machine that had destroyed our mother, buried the truth, and then bought its own innocence with the profits. I left the dinner that night with a cold, terrifying clarity. I had to tear the Vale family apart, but I had to figure out how to do it without turning my sister into collateral damage. I do not sleep for the next 4 days. The polished veneer of the Vale family dinner fades, replaced by the sterile, glowing light of my dual monitors at Stonebridge Risk and Compliance. I use my high-level security clearance to bypass the standard public portals, digging directly into the deep background data of Redmere urban housing. I pull the old municipal permit chains, the redevelopment bonds issued by the city, and the massive insurance claim payouts from 18 years ago. I track down the dissolved limited liability companies, mapping the corporate structure on a massive whiteboard taking up my entire living room wall. The paperwork is a labyrinth purposely designed to exhaust anyone trying to follow the money, but I have spent my entire adult life navigating corporate mazes. I find the rot almost immediately. Redmere was essentially a ghost ship, a disposable corporate entity created solely to absorb liability and vanish the moment the Rowe Street project was closed or compromised. I need people who can operate outside my strict corporate auditing restrictions. I make a secure, encrypted call to Nia Mercer. Nia is a relentless investigative journalist for a major East Coast publication. 2 years ago, I fed her anonymous procurement records that took down a corrupt state senator. She owes me a massive favor, and she does not ask unnecessary questions. Next, I track down Roscoe Bell. He is a retired fire captain who worked the Rowe Street district during the year my mother died. We meet in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, miles away from the wealthy enclaves. He has thick gray hair, a heavy, tired posture, and eyes that have seen too many tragedies. I slide a piece of paper with my mother's name across the sticky Formica table. Roscoe looks at the name, taps his calloused finger against it, and sighs heavily. "I never bought the space heater story," he tells me, his voice rough and quiet. "Your mother was not careless. Penelope." Then he tells me something that makes the breath freeze completely in my lungs. Dana Harrison was not just a frustrated, exhausted tenant making angry phone calls to avoid. She was organizing the entire block. She walked door to door after her diner shifts, gathering 32 signatures from other residents documenting the sparking outlets, the frequent power surges, and the distinct burning smell inside the walls. More importantly, Roscoe reveals she had a confirmed, scheduled meeting with a senior city inspector for 9 o'clock the very next morning. The fire broke out at midnight. She was not just silenced by a tragic accident. Her death was a profoundly convenient, highly effective structural erasure. She was killed because she was about to cost them money. Nia brings the modern pieces of the puzzle to my apartment 2 nights later. While I am locked in the past, she starts pulling the current financial filings for Graham's flagship enterprise, Vale Civic Renewal. What she drops onto my kitchen counter is a masterpiece of modern financial realism, cold and utterly ruthless. Over the past 5 years, Graham has been winning massive, publicly subsidized housing restoration contracts across 3 states, but the numbers simply do not balance. Nia uncovers that nearly $15 million allocated specifically for tenant relocation assistance have vanished into the ether. She shows me the routing numbers. The funds are being systematically siphoned through a complex network of bogus vendor invoices into luxury redevelopment shell companies controlled entirely by the Vale Family Trust. The pattern is sickeningly identical to what happened to my mother, just polished and sanitized for a new decade. Graham uses public taxpayer money to acquire vulnerable properties. He executes unsafe, rapid rehabilitation work, displaces the original tenants under the false guise of temporary relocation, inflates the construction invoices, and drains the compliance funds dry. Then, He hosts lavish ribbon-cutting ceremonies with smiling politicians and local news cameras, while the buildings themselves remain structural death traps waiting to collapse or burn. But to legally and socially destroy him, I need the connective tissue. I need the unbreakable bridge between the fire that killed my mother and the corporate empire he runs today. It takes me 72 straight hours of digging through digitized microfiche files and buried legal archives, a mind-numbing process of cross-referencing thousands of dead documents, but I finally find it. It is a single, overlooked internal waiver from Redmere Urban Housing. It was misfiled under a minor plumbing dispute in the municipal archives, a simple clerical error that kept it out of the original shredding pile 18 years ago. The document explicitly authorizes the hiring of a cheaper, unvetted electrical wiring subcontractor for the Rowe Street project, directly overriding the city's mandatory safety code. And sitting right there at the bottom of the page, authorizing the fatal deviation, is a signature chain that leads directly to Graham Vale's executive authorization code. I sit back in my desk chair, staring at the glowing monitor as the sun rises over the city skyline. My hands are shaking slightly, but my mind is utterly still, gripped by a terrifying absolute clarity. For 18 years, I thought my anger was a solitary, deeply personal burden. I thought I was simply hunting the man who ruined my family. But this is so much bigger than revenge for one death. Graham has been repeating this exact business model for his entire career. He hides the structural risk, cashes out early, and lets ordinary, invisible people absorb the catastrophic damage. He is a parasite wearing a bespoke suit, feeding continuously on the most vulnerable corners of the housing market. Suddenly, the looming wedding date is no longer a source of dread or anxiety. It transforms into a supreme tactical advantage. In exactly 3 weeks, Graham will gather his entire world into one confined space. He is flying in his major investors, city donors, political allies, and press-friendly elites. He wants to showcase his dynasty, using my sister as a beautiful, pliable prop to signal stability, longevity, and philanthropic grace to the market. They will all be sitting in that waterfront glass conservatory, drinking $800 champagne, believing they are attending a celebration of wealth and love. They have absolutely no idea they are actually holding front-row tickets to a controlled demolition. I am going to let Graham build his perfect, glittering stage. I will let him fill the room with everyone he needs to impress. And then, I am going to lock the doors and burn his legacy to the ground while his entire empire watches him fall. It is exactly 9 days before the ceremony, when I finally attempt to warn my sister. We are sitting on the faded rug in my living room, surrounded by dozens of ivory envelopes and silver sealing wax. Tessa is exhausted. Her shoulders slumped under the immense, invisible weight of merging into a dynasty. I watch her carefully trace a wealthy stranger's name onto a place card, and I realize I cannot let her walk blindfolded into Graham Vale's meticulously constructed trap. I start carefully. I do not drop raw accusations or mention the staggering financial fraud I have uncovered with Nia and Roscoe. Instead, I ask gentle, probing questions about the legal structure of her new life. I ask if she has actually read the dense trust documents Graham's lawyers pushed across the table last week. I suggest, keeping my voice entirely level, that we hire an independent attorney to review the marital paperwork just to ensure her own assets and liabilities are properly insulated from the Vale corporate umbrella. Tessa stops writing. She places her silver pen on the coffee table with a sharp, deliberate click. When she looks up at me, her eyes are completely hard, stripped of the usual sisterly warmth. "You simply cannot stand it, can you?" she says, her voice trembling with a quiet, furious energy. I blink, caught entirely off guard. "Tessa, I am only trying to make sure you are protected." "Protected from what?" "Penelope," she demands, pushing herself up from the floor. "Protected from a man who actually loves me. Protected from a family that wants to give me the kind of security we never had. Or are you just trying to protect me from stepping into a life that you do not control?" The words strike me with physical force, but I force myself to remain calm. this has absolutely nothing to do with control. You are marrying into a machine. I know how men like Graham operate. They do not give away security for free. There is always a hidden cost. The only person demanding a cost right now is you. Tessa fires back, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. She crosses her arms tightly across her chest, a defensive posture she has used since she was 7 years old. You never stop treating me like a child you have to save. I am not a broken thing you need to fix anymore. But you do not know how to function without a crisis. You do not know how to love me without completely owning my choices. Her accusation devastates me. It stops the breath in my lungs because it contains just enough truth to draw blood. I did build my entire identity around keeping her alive. I became her shield, her provider, and her ultimate authority when I was only 19 years old. My fear for her now is rooted entirely in a desperate, profound love, but to her, it just looks like a heavy, suffocating leash. She grabs her coat and walks out of my apartment, the door slamming shut with a finality that leaves my ears ringing. Less than 24 hours later, the fracture between us has clearly been detected by the very predator I'm trying to fight. My phone rings while I'm at my desk at Stonebridge. It is Graham's executive assistant, informing me that Mr. Vale requests my presence for a private lunch. She does not ask if I'm available. She simply provides the address and the time. The restaurant is located on the 45th floor of a financial district skyscraper, a place where the menus do not list prices and the waiters move like silent ghosts. Graham is already seated at a secluded corner table when I arrive, drinking sparkling water with a twist of lemon. He looks impeccably tailored, his silver hair catching the ambient light. He does not stand when I approach. "Penelope," he says warmly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit. I understand you and Tessa had a rather emotional disagreement yesterday evening. Weddings are a terribly stressful business. They often bring out deep-seated familial anxieties." I sit down, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I do not touch the linen napkin or the water glass. "Tessa and I are fine, Mr. Vale. Sisters occasionally argue." "Of course they do," Graham replies smoothly, interlacing his fingers on the pristine white tablecloth. "But I also know that you have been asking certain questions, looking into old municipal records, reaching out to journalists." He pauses, letting the silence stretch tightly between us. He is not guessing. He knows exactly what I have been doing. His surveillance network is as robust as his financial one. He leans forward slightly, adopting the tone of a benevolent, deeply concerned patriarch. "I admire your tenacity, Penelope. I truly do. It is exactly the kind of fierce loyalty that translates well into the corporate sector. In fact, I have recently been evaluating the board of directors for our primary philanthropic foundation. We need someone with your precise analytical background. It comes with a rather substantial retainer, of course. Say $250,000 annually." I stare at him, letting his bribery hang in the air. "Furthermore," Graham continues, his voice lowering into a register of faux sympathy, "I know the tragic circumstances of your early life. I would very much like to establish a charitable housing grant in the name of Dana Harrison, an initial endowment of $500,000, designed to help families facing sudden residential displacement. A way to turn your past trauma into a beautiful, lasting legacy." He is offering me a fortune, wrapped in the ultimate insult. He is trying to buy my silence using the very name of the woman he murdered through corporate negligence. I look directly into his eyes, refusing to break contact. My firm does not accept consulting retainers from entities with fundamentally broken compliance structures, and my mother's name is not for sale. Graham stops smiling. The warm, patronizing mask completely dissolves, revealing the cold, absolute void underneath. His eyes flatten into something reptilian and dead. The ambient noise of the restaurant seems to entirely fade away. "You are playing an exceptionally dangerous game for a girl who grew up smelling like cheap smoke," he says, his voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper. "I know exactly who you are, Penelope. And I know exactly which old fire still keeps you awake at night. Let the past stay in the ashes where it belongs. If you continue to dig, I will not just ruin your career. I will make sure you burn right alongside your sister's new life. I do not respond. I simply stand up, push my chair in, and walk out of the restaurant, leaving him sitting with his untouched water. When I return to my apartment building that evening, the air in the lobby is stale and quiet. I open my small metal mailbox and find a heavy, unmarked manila envelope resting inside. There is no return address, no postage stamps, only my first name typed on the front in plain black ink. I carry it upstairs, lock my deadbolt, and tear the heavy paper open at my kitchen counter. A small brass key falls out, clattering loudly against the granite. Along with the key is a single piece of thick cardstock. The typed note contains only one sentence. He kept copies in case he ever needed to burn someone else. I turn the brass key over in my hand. Engraved on the back is the address of a high-security, climate-controlled storage facility located on the industrial edge of the city, along with the unit number 412. I do not wait for the morning. I drive through the darkened city streets, my heart hammering a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I use the digital keypad to enter the facility, my footsteps echoing loudly down the long, fluorescent-lit corridors until I reach the orange metal door of Unit 412. The brass key turns smoothly in the lock. I pull the heavy door upward. The space inside smells of old paper, dry air, and metallic dust. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor are 5 tall steel filing cabinets. I spend the next 4 hours sitting on the cold floor, pulling drawers open and reading. It is all here. The original, unaltered archived ledgers, the physical contractor folders bearing the old Redmere Urban Housing logo, the unredacted internal communications regarding the Row Street shortcuts. I even find a damaged external hard drive wrapped carefully in anti-static plastic, holding digital backups of the financial transfers Graham thought he had permanently erased. This is not a random leak. This is a meticulously curated insurance policy. Someone deep inside the Vale inner circle, someone with supreme access and a profound hatred for Graham, wants him utterly destroyed. They handed me the exact weapon I needed. Sitting there surrounded by the undeniable, damning proof of his lifelong crimes. The emotional reality of my situation violently crystallizes. I am no longer simply choosing between staying silent and securing justice. I am holding the power to annihilate a billionaire, but using it means blowing up the very foundation of my sister's impending marriage. I am actively choosing to risk losing Tessa forever in order to stop a man who has never stopped hurting ordinary families. It is a terrifying, heartbreaking choice, but as I trace my finger over my mother's forged signature on a 20-year-old document, I know there is only one path forward. The fire is coming, and this time, Graham Vale is not going to escape the smoke. I spend the next 3 days practically living inside the climate-controlled confines of Unit 412, surviving on lukewarm black coffee and the sheer adrenaline of proximity to the truth. The damaged hard drive I found requires a delicate, tedious extraction process, but my years at Stonebridge Risk and Compliance have taught me how to coax data out of dead metal. When the files finally render on my encrypted laptop screen, the magnitude of the architecture Graham Vale has built takes my breath away. But it is not the scale of the theft that freezes the blood in my veins. It is the signature on the bottom line. I am staring at 36 recent housing transfer authorizations, the exact documents Vale Civic Renewal used to siphon public relocation funds into untraceable luxury development shells. At the bottom of each digital page is a secure cryptographic signature. It does not belong to Graham. It belongs to his son. I pull up Owen's public calendar, cross-referencing the dates of the financial transfers with his social media footprint and corporate travel logs. The discrepancy is glaring. On the exact Tuesday, $2 million were quietly routed through a phantom vendor. Owen was giving a keynote address at a green energy conference in London. On the Thursday, another $1 million vanished. He was trekking through the Andes without cell service. Owen could not have possibly signed these documents. Graham has not simply hidden his lifelong criminal enterprise from his only child. He has meticulously forged a digital paper trail to use Owen as a human shield. If the federal authorities ever breach the corporate firewall, the evidence will point directly away from the patriarch and squarely onto the son. The sheer, breathtaking sociopathy of it makes my hands shake. The following evening, the intercom at my apartment buzzes loudly. I press the speaker button, expecting a food delivery, but Owen's voice crackles through the speaker, sounding hollow and deeply exhausted. I buzz him in, my mind racing through defensive strategies. When I open the door, Owen looks entirely different from the polished, easygoing heir who sat at the long dining table in Boston. He is wearing a rumpled gray sweater, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. He steps into my living room and looks around at the sterile, tidy space, deliberately avoiding my gaze for a long moment before finally speaking. Tessa has barely slept in 3 days. Penelope, Owen says, his voice thick with a quiet desperation. She is terrified of you, and she is terrified of my father, and she feels completely trapped in the middle. I need to know what is actually happening. I need you to tell me the truth. Is your hostility just rooted in some deep, unresolvable class resentment? Do you just hate what my family represents? Or is there something worse going on? Because if this is just about money, I will walk away from all of it for her. But if you know something real, you have to tell me. I look at him. I see a decent man who genuinely loves my sister, standing on the precipice of a canyon he does not even know exists. If I tell him everything, the sheer weight of the betrayal might break him completely, and he might inadvertently tip Graham off. I need a surgical strike. I need to give him a single, undeniable thread and let him pull it himself. I walk over to the kitchen counter, open a secure leather folder, and extract a single sheet of paper. It is a high-resolution copy of the Redmere Urban Housing Internal Electrical Waiver, the document that authorized the fatal shortcuts on Rowe Street 18 years ago. I slide it across the granite island toward him. I do not hate you because you have money. Owen, I say softly, I do not care about your family's social standing. I care about how your father built the foundation. He picks up the paper. At first, his eyes scan the technical jargon with mild confusion. He sees the address, the date, the cost-cutting directives. Then, his gaze drops to the bottom right corner of the page, the approval routing stamp. I watch the exact second his reality shatters. The color drains completely from his face, leaving his skin the color of ash. He recognizes the deeply specific, archaic internal routing format, the precise sequence of initials and departmental codes his father has used for 3 decades. He knows exactly what that stamp means. It is the undeniable thumbprint of Graham Vale, attached to a document that bypassed mandatory safety codes on a building that subsequently burned down. "Where did you get this?" Owen whispers, his fingers trembling slightly against the edge of the paper. "The building that burned was my home." "Owen," I answer, my voice perfectly steady. "My mother died inside it. Your father signed the waiver that killed her, and then he dissolved the company to bury the liability. But that is the past. What you need to worry about right now is the future. Specifically, your own." I do not show him the forged digital signatures. I let the poison of doubt do its work. Owen leaves my apartment without saying another word. For the next 48 hours, I hear nothing. I sit in my apartment, watching the hands of the clock, wondering if I have just pushed him to confess everything to his father. But Owen does not go to Graham. He goes to the Vale Corporate Legal Archives. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, just 5 days before the wedding, Owen returns to my apartment. He does not knock. He simply leans against the doorframe when I open it, looking as though he has aged 10 years. He carries a thick black leather portfolio under his arm. He walks inside, drops the portfolio onto my coffee table, and unzips it. Inside is the complete, unredacted marital trust packet his father's legal team finalized for the wedding. "You were right," Owen says, his voice completely hollowed out, devoid of any remaining illusion. I went looking for the routing stamps. I found something else entirely. He spreads the heavy watermarked pages across the table. He points to a series of deeply buried indemnity clauses and the charter for a newly formed philanthropic shell foundation. Tessa is listed as the primary managing director of this new entity. The legal language is incredibly dense, designed to look like a generous wedding gift, a way to welcome her into the family's charitable arm. But my forensic training translates the dense legalese instantly. It is a financial sinkhole. Graham is legally structuring the new foundation to absorb the highly toxic, fraudulent assets from his recent public housing scams. By making Tessa the director and binding Owen to the indemnity clauses through the marriage, Graham is building an airtight legal firewall. The true, horrifying danger finally clicks into place. If the federal authorities or the press uncover the missing relocation funds after the wedding, Graham intends for the scandal to roll right downhill. The crushing weight of the federal indictments will fall squarely onto the young board affiliates. He is actively planning to sacrifice his own son and my sister to keep his empire pristine. This singular revelation fundamentally transforms the entire landscape of my mission. It is no longer just about standing up at a wedding reception and humiliating a powerful man for a crime he committed 18 years ago. It is no longer a simple equation of public revenge. It has become a highly precise, ticking clock rescue operation. I have to utterly destroy Graham Vale's legal standing and social power without letting my sister and this innocent man become collateral damage in the explosion. Owen looks up at me from the scattered papers. The loyalty that once bound him to his father has been violently severed, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. For the very first time, he is not defending the Vale legacy. He is looking at me as a partner in its demolition. He does not trust me completely, but the paperwork lying between us has made denial a physical impossibility. "Tell me exactly what we are going to do," Owen says, his jaw set tight. Because he is not going to touch her. Exactly 72 hours before the ceremony, the shadow informant finally steps into the light. Owen and I are waiting in the back pew of a vast, empty cathedral downtown, the location specified by a cryptic burner phone message. The heavy wooden doors creak open, and a woman walks down the center aisle, her heels clicking softly against the ancient stone floor. It is Celeste Vale. Owen stands up, his entire body rigid with shock, his breath catching in his throat. His mother does not offer a warm embrace or a tearful apology. She sits in the pew directly in front of us, her posture stiff, clutching a leather handbag that costs more than my annual salary. She looks directly into her son's eyes and tells him she has spent the last 10 years secretly archiving Graham's sins. She knew the day would inevitably arrive when her husband would try to legally sacrifice their only child to save his own empire, and she refused to let Owen take the fall. "Your father does not have a family, Owen," Celeste says, her voice echoing coldly off the vaulted ceilings. "He has a branding strategy. You and I are merely assets on his public balance sheet, meant to signal stability to his investors." She turns her gaze to me, and for the first time, I see profound, exhausting grief in a billionaire's eyes. She confirms everything I suspected about the Rowe Street fire, when my mother, Dana Harrison, refused to stay quiet about the lethal electrical hazards. Graham did not just ignore her. He actively accelerated the project timeline, ordering the unlicensed crews to work through the night to seal the walls before the city inspector could arrive the next morning. When the fire broke out, he personally ensured the investigation was handed to a compliant, well-compensated official who reduced my mother's death to a careless accident. Graham made the narrative simple enough to survive the minimal public scrutiny of a working-class neighborhood. With Celeste's internal roadmap firmly in hand, Owen knows exactly which former executive to corner. We drive to a quiet, affluent suburb to find Ezra Pike, the former finance director for Vale Civic Renewal, who abruptly resigned 8 months ago. Ezra looks terminally tired, a man whose soul has been hollowed out by carrying a decade of toxic, corporate secrets. We sit in his perfectly manicured backyard, and Ezra finally breaks his silence. He confirms that the missing public relocation funds are not just sitting in offshore accounts. Graham has been systematically rerouting the stolen subsidized housing money through the massive philanthropic events attached to the upcoming wedding season. The lavish floral arrangements, the celebrity entertainment, the foundation launches, they are all being financed by money meant to keep displaced families off the streets. Ezra agrees to provide sworn affidavits to our legal team, desperate to clear his conscience before the federal authorities inevitably break down his own door. The momentum accelerates rapidly. The very next morning, Roscoe Bell calls me from a burner phone. The retired fire captain spent the last week leveraging every old favor he had left in the Municipal Emergency Dispatch Center, digging through dusty archival boxes. We meet in a sterile parking garage, and he hands me a digitized audio file on a secure flash drive. It is the original emergency dispatch call from 18 years ago. I sit in the driver's seat of my car, plug the drive into my laptop, and listen to my mother's voice for the first time in nearly 2 decades. She is not panicked about a space heater. Her voice is sharp, angry, and terrifyingly clear. "The walls are sparking," she tells the operator. "The new wiring on the 3rd floor is humming loudly, and the plaster is hot to the touch. Send someone now." It is the absolute, irrefutable destruction of the official tenant negligence lie. The sound of her voice makes my chest ache, but it hardens my resolve into solid steel. I take the audio file, Ezra's affidavits, and the forged digital signatures straight to Nia Mercer. The investigative journalist spreads the evidence across her chaotic desk, her eyes wide with predatory excitement. She has the story of the decade, a sprawling exposé that connects municipal manslaughter to modern wire fraud. She wants to publish the piece on Friday morning, letting the news cycle devour Graham before the rehearsal dinner even begins. I tell her absolutely not. A Friday morning publication gives Graham 24 hours to deploy his army of lawyers, spin the narrative, and file emergency injunctions to suppress the reach of the story. I look Nia directly in the eyes and tell her I want the article to go live on Saturday evening, at exactly 8:30. I want Graham exposed at the precise second his ego is at its absolute peak, standing in front of the very room he curated to worship him, with absolutely nowhere to hide and no time to rewrite the truth. Nia smiles sharply and agrees. But before we can strike, Owen and I must ensure Tessa is completely shielded from the blast radius. We meet with a highly discreet, ruthlessly effective trust attorney operating out of a small, unmarked office in the financial district. We lay out the fraudulent marital foundation documents Graham created to trap my sister. The attorney drafts a preemptive severability injunction. The exact minute Nia's article hits the internet and the forged authorizations become public record, this attorney will electronically file the injunction with the state courts. It will instantly freeze any attempt to legally bind Tessa to the poisoned trust structure. Graham's carefully constructed legal firewall will shatter before it even activates, leaving him to face the crushing weight of the federal indictments entirely alone. Inside the glass walls of Vale Civic Renewal, Graham is beginning to sense the rapidly shifting atmospheric pressure. Owen returns from the corporate headquarters and reports that his father is spiraling into a deep, aggressive paranoia. Graham has ordered massive internal audits of every department. He is threatening his senior staff, seizing executive hard drives, and hiring private security firms to trace potential leaks. He knows a catastrophic breach has occurred, but because his entire empire is built on compartmentalized dishonesty, he cannot pinpoint the source of the infection. He deliberately kept his executives isolated from one another to maintain total control, and now that very isolation prevents him from seeing the unified front forming in the shadows. He cannot tell which betrayal is finally going to kill him. The tension sharpens to a razor's edge around the meticulously planned wedding schedule. Everything must execute with flawless, mechanical precision. Every single person in our newly formed alliance has one specific job, one critical timestamp, and one singular chance to make sure Graham Vale cannot escape the consequences of his actions. Celeste will secure the original hard drives from the storage unit. Ezra will transmit his signed affidavits directly to the federal prosecutor. Nia will cue the massive publication for Saturday night. Roscoe will ensure the local authorities receive the verified audio file. Owen will handle the audiovisual team at the reception, securing access to the massive screens. And I will stand up in front of 300 people, look Graham Vale in the eye, and light the match. The rehearsal dinner concludes exactly on schedule, a masterpiece of forced smiles and clinking crystal. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the sprawling Newport estate finally goes quiet, the heavy fog rolling off the Atlantic to swallow the manicured lawns. I am sitting on the edge of the velvet armchair in my guest suite, staring at the muted television, when a soft, hesitant knock sounds at my door. I open it to find Tessa standing in the hallway. She has stripped off her designer silk dress and is wearing an oversized, faded gray sweatshirt I bought for her 10 years ago. She looks incredibly small, her eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by the agonizing friction of the past week. She steps inside without a word and sits on the edge of the mattress, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. "I need you to look me in the eye and answer me honestly," Tessa says, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with a fragile, exhausted kind of desperation. "Is this really about protecting me? Or is this just about avenging what happened on Rowe Street? Because I feel like I'm standing on a landmine, and I do not know if you are trying to disarm it or if you are the one holding the detonator." The raw pain in her question physically aches. I walk over to my travel bag, unzip the hidden side compartment, and pull out a small, tarnished brass key tag. It is stamped with the number 312. I sit down next to her on the bed and gently press the cold metal into her palm, folding her fingers over it. "This was the key to our apartment," I tell her quietly. "I kept it because it was the only thing I had left of her that the fire did not ruin. Tessa, I never wanted you to inherit my grief. I spent my entire adult life building walls, so you would never have to feel the smoke in your lungs. I only ever wanted you to inherit the truth. I am so deeply sorry that the truth arrived later than it should have, and I am sorry it is wearing the face of the family you are about to join." Tessa stares down at her closed fist, a single tear slipping free and tracking down her pale cheek. She is completely torn, caught in the devastating crossfire between the life she desperately wants, the gentle man she genuinely loves, and the terrifying realization that her entire future is wrapped inside fraudulent paperwork she never truly understood. She lays her head against my shoulder, a gesture she has not offered in years, and we sit in the heavy, unbroken silence of the early morning. An hour later, after Tessa finally falls asleep in my bed, the walls of the suite feel too tight. I step out into the dimly lit, wood-paneled corridor to find the kitchen for a glass of water. I do not make it to the stairs. Graham Vale steps out of the shadows near the library doors, his posture rigid, the charming patriarch facade completely stripped away. In the dim amber light of the hallway sconces, his eyes are entirely dead. He blocks my path, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne rolling over me like a threat. "You have been awfully quiet this evening," Graham says, his tone perfectly flat and devoid of any warmth. I do not like quiet women. They are unpredictable. I stop 3 feet away from him, keeping my breathing completely steady. "I have nothing left to say to you, Mr. Vale." He takes a step closer, invading my physical space, trying to use his height to force me to step back. I anchor my feet into the thick carpet and do not move a single inch. "Let me explain exactly what happens tomorrow," Graham whispers, his voice dropping into a register of pure malice. "If you attempt to humiliate me, if you try to disrupt this union with your pathetic, unfounded conspiracy theories, I will utterly bury you. I will make one phone call to the partners at Stonebridge and ensure your career is vaporized by noon. I will tie you up in defamation lawsuits until your legal fees bankrupt you, and then I will leverage my network to ensure you are socially exiled from every respectable circle on the East Coast. You will have absolutely nothing." I look directly into his cold, calculating eyes, feeling an unnerving, absolute calm wash over my entire body. He is trying to wield the only weapons he understands. You think ruin is an empty bank account, I say, my voice perfectly clear and unshakable in the quiet corridor. You think ruin is a bad reputation and a lost job. You do not know what ruin actually is. Ruin is standing on a freezing sidewalk at 2 a.m, holding a 5-year-old girl, watching your entire world burn down to the studs, while men in expensive suits write your mother off as a rounding error. You cannot threaten me with ruin, Graham. I already lived through the kind of ruin that your money cannot fix. Graham's jaw tightens violently, a muscle ticking in his cheek. For the first time, he looks at me and sees someone he cannot buy, intimidate, or destroy. I walk past him without another word, leaving him standing alone in the dark. When I return to my suite, a shadow peels away from the doorway. It is Owen. He is clutching a thick manila folder, his chest heaving as if he just ran a mile. We step inside quietly so we do not wake Tessa. I use the old master code to get into his private office, Owen whispers, spreading the documents across the small glass coffee table. I thought I had seen the worst of it. I was wrong. I lean over the papers. They are advanced prospectuses for a massive corporate refinancing deal scheduled to close on Monday morning. A cash injection worth hundreds of millions of dollars from a consortium of European banks. The European lenders were getting nervous about his domestic liabilities, Owen explains, his voice thick with disgust. He needed a massive signal of generational stability to lock down their confidence. He is using the marriage itself. This entire weekend is a highly leveraged financial prop, but that is not the most damning part. Owen flips to the final section of the risk management portfolio. Graham has specifically inserted language proving that if the recent relocation fund scandal ever breaks in the press, all public and fiduciary blame will be immediately redirected toward the young board affiliates of the newly formed philanthropic trust. The documents explicitly name Owen, and by extension, Tessa. Graham literally priced his son's freedom into the deal to save himself. The sky outside the window begins to turn a pale, bruised purple. By the time dawn finally breaks over the jagged coastline, every major emotional line has been permanently drawn in the sand. Tessa is heartbroken, mourning the illusion of the family she thought she was joining. Owen is profoundly disillusioned, stripped of the last lingering shreds of loyalty to the man who raised him. Celeste is awake in the city, holding the preservation copies of the evidence, ready to testify against her own husband. And I am entirely done waiting for the powerful to choose decency on their own. The quiet hours of psychological warfare are over. Today, the Glass Conservatory will open its doors, the orchestra will play, and the fire will finally catch. I sit quietly in the third row of the cathedral during the wedding ceremony. I watch my sister repeat the sacred vows, her voice trembling slightly under the vaulted ceiling. I watch Owen slide the heavy platinum band onto her finger. I allow the rings to be exchanged, and I allow the officiant to pronounce them husband and wife. I do this deliberately, because my years in forensic compliance have taught me the precise architecture of true devastation. If I disrupt the wedding before the vows are spoken, Graham Vale simply becomes the victim of a hysterical, jealous sister, and the crowd will rally to his defense with sympathetic whispers. But if I wait until the reception, until he believes the trap is completely sprung and his European refinancing deal is permanently secured by the optics of this union, his sudden fall will be absolute. 2 hours later, we are all seated inside the massive glass conservatory built on the edge of the Newport Cliffs. The room is a glowing, opulent jewel box filled with 300 of the most powerful investors, politicians, and socialites on the eastern seaboard. The champagne is flowing freely, the string quartet is playing a lively symphony, and Graham is completely in his element. He moves from table to table, practically vibrating with the arrogant triumph of a man who believes he has just successfully purchased another human being to shield his empire. When the time comes for the evening toasts, Graham takes his place behind the microphone at the center of the head table. He raises his crystal glass, the faceted edges catching the brilliant light of the overhead chandeliers. He begins his speech with the easy, practiced charm of a lifelong predator, thanking his wealthy donors and praising his son. Then, exactly as he did during our first meeting, he pivots to dress his profound cruelty as sophisticated wit. We are, of course, absolutely thrilled to welcome Tessa into a family with true standards, Graham announces, his voice echoing cleanly through the surround sound system. It is a testament to her resilient spirit that she managed to escape the cheap instability and the desperate survival mode of her youth. We must also acknowledge her older sister, Penelope, who did the very best she could with her severely limited resources, even if her methods were as fundamentally unstable as the environment they came from. A ripple of uneasy, polite laughter moves through the room. Graham smiles broadly, soaking in the collective validation of his peers. He thinks he is untouchable. I do not look down at my plate. I push my chair back, the wooden legs scraping sharply against the polished marble floor. I stand up, smoothing the front of my navy dress. The quiet murmur of the crowd abruptly dies away, replaced by a sudden, suffocating tension. I do not walk toward the microphone. I simply project my voice across the wide expanse of white linen and floating candles, speaking with the cold, measured cadence of a prosecuting attorney delivering an opening statement. Before we raise a glass to your glorious future, Mr. Vale, I say, ensuring every single syllable cuts through the heavy air. I have a very simple question about your past. Do you remember the name Dana Harrison? The temperature in the conservatory seems to plummet instantly. The smile violently vanishes from Graham's face, replaced by a dark, furious flush. He grips the edges of the podium. This is highly inappropriate. Penelope, Graham snaps, his voice losing its polished warmth. If your grief and your petty class resentment are making you hysterical, my security team will gladly escort you back to your hotel suite. You did not answer the question, I reply, stepping out from behind my table. She was my mother. 18 years ago, you authorized unlicensed electrical work in her building on Rose Street, and she burned to death because of it. The ballroom erupts into shocked gasps. Graham immediately attempts to regain control of his narrative, raising a dismissive hand toward the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive this ridiculous outburst. This young woman has been dangerously obsessed with our family ever since Owen and Tessa began dating. She is peddling an ancient, debunked conspiracy theory about a tragic accident. He tries to say more, but he is suddenly cut off by a sound that completely shatters the elegant atmosphere. At exactly 8:30 in the evening, a discordant symphony of notifications explodes across the room. Pockets vibrate, purses chime, custom ringtones echo loudly from every single table. 300 politicians, investors, and elite guests simultaneously look down at their glowing screens. Nia Mercer's sprawling investigative exposé has just gone live across 3 major national news syndicates. The push notifications boldly declare the connection between municipal manslaughter, missing public relocation funds, and the Vale corporate empire. Before Graham can even process the digital avalanche happening right in front of him, Owen stands up from the head table. He does not look at his father. He looks directly at the audiovisual team, stationed in the elevated tech booth at the back of the room, and gives them a single, sharp nod. The massive digital projection screens positioned behind the dance floor, which had been displaying softly fading montages of the couple's childhoods, suddenly snap to a harsh, blinding white. The romantic music is abruptly cut off. The screens instantly fill with the cold, undeniable geometry of legal documents. First, the old Redmere urban housing electrical waiver appears, 30 feet high, with Graham's personal routing stamp clearly highlighted in bright red ink for every investor to see. Then, the screen splits. The digitized audio file of my mother's desperate emergency dispatch call begins to play over the massive ballroom speakers, her panicked voice echoing off the glass walls, reporting the sparking wires and the heat in the plaster. Graham recoils as if he has been physically struck. "Turn that off," he screams, pointing frantically at the tech booth. "Cut the power to those screens right now." But the AV team has already locked the system. The presentation advances, The screens now display the modern wire transfer receipts. They show the forged digital authorizations bearing Owen's name, seamlessly cross-referenced with his international travel logs. Finally, the display shifts to the newly drafted Marital Foundation Trust. At the head table, Tessa stares up at the towering screens. She reads the dense indemnity clauses magnified in high definition. She sees her own name clearly listed as the primary managing director of the fraudulent shell company. The terrifying reality crashes over her in a single, breathless wave. She realizes that all of my frantic warnings were not an attempt to sabotage her happiness or control her life. I was trying to prevent her from becoming a human shield for a federal crime. The anger and betrayal she had directed at me for the past week completely evaporates, flipping violently toward the man standing at the podium. "This is corporate sabotage," Graham shouts, his voice cracking with sheer panic as he realizes his primary investors are actively reading the evidence of his fraud. These documents are complete fabrications. They are the work of disgruntled, dead subcontractors and rogue accountants. This entire display is nothing but the sick obsession of a resentful girl trying to ruin a beautiful evening. He is desperately trying to execute one final performance, throwing blame into the shadows, hoping his wealth and his aggressive confidence will carry him through the storm. Then, Celeste Vale rises from her chair at the front table. She does not yell. She does not weep. She simply turns to face the crowd of horrified elites, many of whom she has hosted in her own home for decades. "They are not fabrications, Graham," Celeste says, her voice perfectly steady, carrying a heavy, lethal clarity that silences the entire room. "I know they are real because I am the one who kept the physical copies. I preserved the ledgers and the hard drives for 18 years, precisely because I always knew that one day you would try to sacrifice our son the exact same way you sacrificed those innocent families." The grand reception instantly descends into a frozen, apocalyptic silence. The catering staff stands paralyzed by the kitchen doors. Cameras flash wildly from the back tables as reporters invited for good publicity realize they are currently standing inside the crime scene of the decade. Whispers turn into panicked, overlapping shouts. The elite guests are already dialing their attorneys and wealth managers, desperate to untangle their own portfolios from the toxic implosion of the Vale Empire. Graham stands at the podium, surrounded by the ruins of his perfectly curated night. He looks at his wife. He looks at his son. And he looks at me. He is trapped in the center of the glass cage he built to showcase his power. The social and legal panic is entirely suffocating him, but the true, absolute resolution of his punishment is still held back for the final movement. I watch him breathe heavily in the flashing lights, knowing that while his reputation is currently bleeding out on the marble floor, he has not yet been stripped of his freedom in full. Graham Vale does not yell anymore. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch who stood at the podium just 5 minutes ago completely evaporates, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He calculates his odds in a fraction of a second. He drops the microphone onto the white linen tablecloth, the heavy thud echoing through the frozen ballroom, and steps off the dais. He moves swiftly toward the private side exit of the glass conservatory, a discreet path meant only for the catering staff. He wants to reach his waiting town car or his helicopter before the local news vans breach the heavy iron gates of the estate. I watch him walk away. I do not run after him. I do not raise my voice. I simply let him open the door. Graham pushes the heavy glass open, stepping out into the cool, damp ocean air, only to abruptly stop dead in his tracks. Standing on the manicured green lawn, illuminated by the harsh, sweeping red and blue lights of unmarked federal vehicles, are 8 senior investigators from the Department of Justice and the State Attorney General's office. They are holding thick, sealed manila folders containing immediate arrest warrants for massive bond fraud, aggravated document forgery, and federal obstruction of justice. Graham turns back, trying to retreat into the warmth of the ballroom, but the federal agents step inside the conservatory with him, their dark suits a stark contrast to the pastel gowns and tuxedos of the guests. Graham tries his usual, blustering defense. his voice echoing loudly over the silent, terrified crowd. He vehemently claims the records displayed on the massive digital screens are entirely fabricated, illegally obtained by a mentally unstable woman carrying a decades-old grudge. But I planned for every single one of his expensive, high-powered defense strategies. I step forward, my voice perfectly level, and calmly inform him that he cannot dismiss the evidence as stolen or fake. I tell him that Ezra Pike has already given sworn, recorded testimony to the federal prosecutor regarding the philanthropic donor shells. I point to his wife, reminding him that Celeste holds the unbroken, legally verified chain of custody for the physical preservation copies of the hard drives. I announce that Roscoe Bell officially submitted the unaltered emergency dispatch audio directly into the municipal public record this morning. And finally, I tell him that his own son's internal security access logs explicitly trace the forged transfer authorizations directly back to his personal executive terminal. The steel trap I built around him over the last 3 weeks has absolutely zero exits. The legal case is entirely locked shut. In the most emotionally devastating moment of the entire night, Tessa moves. She steps up to the abandoned podium, her heavy hand-embroidered wedding dress rustling loudly in the absolute silence of the room. She picks up the microphone. Her hand shakes violently at first, but then she grips it tightly, her voice finding a deep, resonant strength I have not heard since she was a little girl. For the last week, I thought I was finally stepping into a family that could offer me real, permanent security, Tessa says, looking out at the sea of horrified, wealthy faces. Then, she turns to look directly at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But the only real stability I have ever known came from a 19-year-old girl who sacrificed her entire youth to make sure I had winter coats, hot meals, and a safe place to sleep. The stability my sister gave me was built on pure love and absolute truth. Mr. Vale, your version of stability is nothing but an incredibly expensive camouflage for a graveyard. Owen steps up right beside her. He looks at his father, a billionaire currently being read his Miranda rights by federal agents in front of his wealthiest peers and political allies. I publicly reject your protection, Owen says loudly, making sure the entire room, and the reporters frantically typing on their phones, hear him clearly. I refuse to let this marriage, or my wife, ever be used as a legal shield for your crimes. I do not belong to your empire anymore. Owen takes Tessa's hand, and together, they step down from the elevated dais. They walk across the marble floor and stand squarely beside me. Owen chooses the hard truth over the comfortable dynasty that raised him. The lavish wedding reception does not end with a grand exit, tossed rose petals, or polite applause. It ends with the terrifying, metallic sound of handcuffs clicking shut. The investors, the politicians, and the socialites scramble frantically for the main doors, desperate to distance their own reputations from the radioactive fallout. Graham is led out of the glass conservatory by the authorities, completely socially, legally, and morally abandoned in the exact opulent room he spent millions of dollars intending to dominate. The aftermath does not happen overnight. It takes months of grueling legal hearings, endless depositions, and aggressive audits. But the justice system finally does the heavy lifting it should have done 18 years ago. My mother's official fire report is legally amended. Her brave complaints are formally acknowledged and permanently entered into the public record, clearing her name of any negligence. The federal prosecutor opens a massive, sweeping review into every single luxury redevelopment file Graham profited from over the last 2 decades. Tessa and Owen do not rush forward into a broken dynamic. They officially postpone their marriage, canceling the fraudulent trust and ripping up the tainted legal bindings. It is not a dramatic breakup or a cheap cliffhanger for the society tabloids. It is a profoundly mature, difficult choice to strip away the spectacle and rebuild their relationship entirely on a foundation of truth. 6 months later, they quietly reunite. They stand in front of a judge at a modest, quiet city hall, marrying on their own terms without a single camera, corporate sponsor, or hidden agenda in sight. I use the massive legal settlement extracted from the Vale estate, combined with my share of the recovered public relocation funds, to establish a brand new organization. I call it the Harrison Housing Justice Fund. I permanently leave my corporate auditing job at Stonebridge Risk and Compliance to run the fund full-time. We use the money to provide aggressive, top-tier legal representation and immediate financial assistance to vulnerable families facing unlawful displacement by predatory developers. I take the oldest, deepest wound my family ever suffered and actively forge it into a powerful shield that protects other tenants from polished monsters. The final, most important emotional beat happens in my small apartment living room, just the two of us. Tessa comes over for Sunday coffee. She sits on my faded rug, looks at me, and finally says the words that heal the last remaining fracture between our hearts. She tells me she understands now that I did not ruin a wedding out of bitterness, class resentment, or a desperate need for control. She knows I stopped a devastating lie from becoming her permanent address. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I drive the 2 hours back to Baltimore. The city has finally erected a proper, beautifully restored memorial wall in a small, peaceful park near the old Rowe Street district, dedicated to the victims of the negligent housing fires. I walk up to the smooth black stone and reach out, gently pressing my fingertips against the freshly engraved letters of my mother's name. The air does not smell like smoke, cheap linoleum, or panic anymore. It just smells like rain and new grass. Some people in the press still call what I did to the Vale family a masterclass in calculated public revenge. But I close my eyes, feeling the solid, cold stone under my hand, and I know the absolute truth. I call it the final inspection that should have happened 18 years ago. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Where in the world are you listening from? Please drop a comment below to chat and share your thoughts on Penelope's journey. If you enjoyed this, do not forget to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.